All right. It is October 31st, 2025. Happy Halloween, everyone. Oh, look, I even set up my little fiberglass jack-o'-lantern back there. That's about as dressed as I get this set. It is the Prospect Weekly Roundup. I am David Dayen, executive editor of American Prospect, your host. And with us today, very excited, uh, uh, David, do you have to walk around your kid today on Halloween, or is he too old now?
One of my kids has aged out, I think, of trick or treating. He is about to turn 15. But my daughter, who is 11, she is
You
very
will be.
excited. Yes, I will be.
Who is she dressing up as?
She's still deciding. I don't want to pin her
So,
down.
do you know it's tonight?
I
Right.
do know it's tonight.
She's still working
Yes,
on it.
yes, yes, still working on
All right. Well, we have girl dad and
it.
uh, poster extraordinaire David Sirota here. I brought David on because he has a new book. I have it right here. Master Plan, The Hidden Plot to Legalize Corruption in America. Co-author is Jared Jakang Maher. And this is cool. This is like it's kind of like in the 80s when they do a novelization of a movie. So the novel would come out after the movie.
Yeah.
So you'd be all excited, like, hey, I can read the Superman movie. This is the novelization of the podcast, Master Plan, which came out last year to much acclaim. And as mentioned, it's really the story of how we got to this incredible situation in America where big money, dark money, not only rules our elections but kind of rules our life. And you know, tell me about what it was like translating this. You had a podcast, you had a narrative. What more did you want to put into the written form to like why do this project?
Yeah, well, first of all, the book goes frankly much deeper than the podcast. Although the podcast is pretty deep. I think that there were things that were left on the cutting room floor, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
documents, side stories and the like. So that all of that is now in there. So that was one goal, is that I just there was so much stuff that we found that we just couldn't put in the audio. And as a related to that, there's stuff that's visual. I think seeing, for instance, as an example, the excerpt that the Prospect ran
Mm-hmm.
about the campaign for capitalism, which sounds insane,
Right.
but how the conservative movement joined with the Ford administration to run a national ad campaign for capitalism as a response to their fears that nativism and I guess socialism was, or their fears that socialism was on the rise. And I think the point is that that's hard to translate into audio, and I wanted people to be able to actually literally see it, because the thing is with the podcast and with this topic area, I think it's that when you talk about it, it can kind of sound like you're way down a rabbit hole talking about some wild conspiracy theory that can't possibly be
Mm-hmm.
true. And yet everything that we uncover uh is um is documented, right? Like
Right.
they like especially in the early 1970s when the this master plan was coming into reality, they were writing everything down, and I wanted people to be able to see it.
Right.
And I wanted there to frankly be a physical, a physical, this to be physical in the world, like a physical representation of this in the
Right.
world, because I also think like something about digital media feels kind of ephemeral. And I sometimes get afraid that like, and we've seen evidence of this where digital media sort of disappears before our eyes, right? Like the sort
Mm-hmm.
of there's some, what's it called? It's like web rot or something. There's some
Link
term
rot.
for
Yeah.
link
Mm-hmm.
rot, right? So
Yeah.
I wanted there to be this in the world. And then one other point to make on this. One thing that we've learned in our audio work at the Lever is that the the listening audience is often different than the reading audience. That really there's overlap, obviously, but I do think that there are some people who are like, I'll never listen to a podcast, but I will always read books. And there are people who are saying, I will only listen to podcasts and I don't read books anymore. And so we wanted to take the work that we did and put it into multiple formats.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's totally true. As someone who does a podcast as well, that those are totally different audiences. Even the audience for this weekly roundup, we have people that come here that are dedicated. So,
Yep.
yeah, very good point. So let's get into it. Let's talk about what's in the book. You start and you really frame this with the story of Lewis Powell. And why don't we just have you say, who is Lewis Powell and why is he so important to what you call this master plan?
So I'm gonna let's like do the Wayne's World like
There you
all
go.
right, so we're
There you
going
go.
back to 1971. And in 1971, uh, Ralph Nader is this huge political force passing things through Congress. He's basically a political celebrity. He's being rumored as a vice presidential candidate, passing things, food safety and auto safety, et cetera, et cetera. He's on the Nixon tapes where Nixon is freaking out about how much success that he's having in Congress. And Ralph
I
Nader,
remember in the 60s, like GM hired private investigators to
yes,
tail him and to
yes,
try to come up with like compromat,
yeah,
sort of blackmail him, try to throw women at him,
right.
and it only made him stronger. So he was really this totemic kind of figure.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a different galaxy in a whole different political
Yes,
universe. And Ralph Nader gets written up in Fortune magazine, like
right,
the magazine of the oligarchy.
right.
He gets written up. And actually, side note, one of our listeners and readers um, sent us the original Fortune magazine. So I actually have
Oh,
this
nice.
Fortune magazine. It's amazing. And that's all a context for the fact that Lewis Powell reads the Fortune magazine article and has kind of a freak out. And Lewis Powell is a tobacco lawyer on the board of Philip Morris. He's been
Right,
president of the American Bar Association. So, sort of, his law firm advises big corporations. He is like Mr. Corporate Establishment. And he is living in Richmond, and he's friends with a chain store mogul who is the president of the Chamber of Commerce, and he decides to write a memo to the Chamber of Commerce, essentially saying that Ralph Nader and Nader types are a an existential threat to free market enterprise, the
right,
capitalist system, the sort of corporate system of America, and media and the business community and those with means need to invest heavily in American politics and media because essentially the government has become too responsive to what people want. That's
right,
really the crux of this. And it's again shrouded in, it's a threat to the free market system, et cetera, et cetera. But it really is like the people are getting too much of what they want. And so soon after Lewis Powell writes this memo, it starts circulating among the business elite. It remains private for not published, but circulating for a year. And in the interim, Lewis Powell gets a phone call from Richard Nixon, gets nominated to the Supreme Court. And his nomination sails through because he is portrayed as this sort of moderate, and Nixon's two previous nominees had been rejected or had withdrawn over segregation
right.
positions. So Lewis Powell is seen as this moderate, and importantly, as you'll read in the book, Lewis Powell has developed a friendship with J. Edgar Hoover, uh, uh, sort of mutual hatred of the hippies. They've developed a correspondence where Hoover is asking for him to essentially, expose communists in the legal profession. And shocker of all shockers, the Powell memo which is this incendiary call to arms, is not found by the FBI investigators who forward information to the US Senate when they consider his nomination. So
Hmm.
his nomination sails through. And there's a lot of, retro history where some people have said, if senators knew that he had written the Powell memo, it at least would have been a centerpiece of the hearings, and he may have even
Yeah.
gotten voted down. Anyway, so that pays off for Lewis Powell. The Powell memo does not get exposed for another in the newspapers for another year in a Jack Anderson column. But
Right.
Powell is now on the Supreme Court. He's given a send-off party by Philip Morris at this lavish event in New York City that had never been exposed until our book exposed it, which is where
Is that the
Walt,
Cronkite thing?
right,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
where Philip Morris's executives present him with a judicial robe emblazoned with corporate logos. We have the photos of this in the book, okay, and they pressed a commemorative vinyl record of the recordings where Walter Cronkite, then the CBS News anchor, does a
Right.
sort of mock rendition of his then big Sunday program, You Are There,
Right.
valorizing Lewis Powell's life. I mean, you cannot make this is where I say it, like it sounds like a conspiracy theory. I
It
sound like a
it
crazy
you
person.
actually sound barking mad right now.
Right. I mean,
But
it's all real.
one of the interesting things is that this trajectory of Powell, that he's sort of seen as kind of a moderate, if you look away from his deep corporate business ties, is recapitulated throughout the book. Like I keep seeing it come up again and again. John Roberts, kind of in the same way. Anthony Kennedy. They all sort of present this fluffy image, but in reality, they have, very much instituted a corporate court, and it's all a backlash. At least on the Roberts and Kennedy side, it's a backlash to what happened to Robert Bork, right? That you can't be out and out ideologically deeply conservative, but you can be a corporate conservative that just sort of sands off the edges.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's about the fact that these people kind of speak the language of I wouldn't even call it moderation, but kind of like sensible, thoughtful, not voluble rhetoric and language, even as they are implementing a radical agenda. And the thing is that Lewis Powell, what's really interesting about Lewis Powell's this part of his life is that he's presenting this sort of moderate image, but he's also like giving speeches that are more and more angry about communism, leftism, hippies, right? He's being radicalized in the moment. This is the
Right.
era of like Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan, et cetera, et cetera. So he's giving these sort of private speeches, but then in the public forums, he's coming off as like a polite Southern gentleman. Now,
Right.
where this all hits the road is that after he writes his memo, he gets confirmed on the court. The Chamber of Commerce organizes this secret task force to implement the Powell memo. Again, I know I sound like a conspiracy theorist here, but
Right.
you can read the members of the task force. They literally call it the task force on the Powell memo, and it's all about how do they take the recommendations of the Powell memo
You
and
have
put
like a
it
seating chart
right. There's like a
from one
seating
of these
chart.
meetings.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And they're going over, we've now got, radio actualities, and we're funding a motion picture, and we've got newspaper editorials and radio ads. We're talking about the powerful corporate executives, some of whom come from the largest media outlets in the country. We have a
Right.
letter from the president of CBS saying that he agrees with what the Powell memo is saying about the attack on the free market, and that he is working to correct the situation. That's a direct quote, working to correct the situation at
Right.
CBS News.
Which
But
is
here,
which is kind of an interesting valence given what's happening right now with
yes,
CBS News, which is supposed to be a break from the liberal media past, the liberal lion past of CBS. But what your book shows is that there are some things that are bipartisan, and one of them is thou shalt not disrupt corporate America.
Exactly. Now, where the for Powell, where the rubber really hits the road is now he's on the Supreme Court. So what does Lewis Powell do on the Supreme Court very soon after he gets on the Supreme Court? Well, one, he helps engineer a then radical ruling that takes a radical fringe theory that money in politics is not corruption or undue influence. Money in politics is constitutionally protected speech. This is
Right.
a theory forged by John Bolton, like the same John Bolton way back then.
Right.
John Bolton was on the legal team of the case that came to the Supreme Court, and that case came out of the post-Watergate campaign finance and anti-corruption reforms, which were a big victory for the anti-corruption movement. They used the crisis of Watergate was used for that, but the moment that that bill was signed by Gerald Ford, there was a legal effort to begin unwinding it. John Bolton was on the legal team, unwinding it through an argument that money in politics needs to be treated as constitutionally protected speech. Lewis Powell
Right.
joins that ruling. And then soon after that, even more interestingly, is a case from Massachusetts comes to the Supreme Court. It's about a bank and a ballot measure on taxes. And the bank basically wants to be able to spend against the ballot
Right.
measure. And there's a law in Massachusetts that essentially says you can't spend, a corporation can't spend against the ballot measure if it doesn't have something directly to do with the thing the corporation is involved in. So it was about income taxes, and the argument was, it didn't have to do with financial regulation. The
Right.
bank goes to the court. Lewis Powell, we have the memos from behind the scenes at the court. Lewis Powell essentially hijacks this case from other justices. Justice Brennan was supposed to write the majority opinion in a narrow ruling about the issues at play. Brennan then says, I don't necessarily think I believe in the majority opinion here of siding with the bank. I'm out. Powell's like, this is my moment. He takes the case, and not only does he take the case as the author of the opinion, he broadens it out in a huge way to not just the merits of this case, and he creates essentially the idea that corporations have those rights,
Right.
that their spending is constitutionally protected speech. That's not just for people, now it's for corporations. That ruling, the Bellotti ruling, becomes the foundation of Citizens United, which is written, of course, by Lewis Powell's immediate successor, Anthony Kennedy.
Yeah. It's interesting because, you can take sort of the lessons of the Powell memo in a number of different directions. There was a very celebrated set of actions in the late 1970s during the Carter administration that basically turned the Federal Trade Commission into a hollow shell. Michael Pershuk was this guy who was kind of the proto Lina Khan. He was a kind of a hard charging guy who came out of the Nader world and public citizen and was doing a lot of things on consumer protection in particular at the FTC. And this was where corporations kind of made their stand in the regulatory world. And they got public opinion to turn on the FTC. And the FTC was so cowed that they essentially did nothing for 40 years. That's one way to tell this story. But you go for, I think, and also just as valid and just as interesting way to tell this story through Powell's presence on the Supreme Court, and specifically the issue of money in politics, which is kind of the issue that stands before everything else. If you want to get to everything else, you want to make progress on anything else that people care about, you have to get through this giant brick wall made by money that corporate America puts up as a roadblock. So take us from, so there's this Bellotti ruling. There's also sort of Buckley versus Vallejo, and there's some other rulings there. What happens in between that ruling and then what we get in Citizens United, which is actually, there's kind of a peak and valley kind of story here, because you have the Federal Election Campaign Act that then Bellotti and some of these other rulings kind of try to neutralize. And then, the pendulum swings back. There's another campaign finance effort that is successful in Congress, and another Republican president kind of grudgingly signs the bill, but then that necessitates the court to step in again. So tell that part of the story.
Yeah, so after the Bellotti ruling, there is it's sort of a flood of corporate PAC money and really money in general into politics. And it's worth
That
mentioning.
both parties participate in, we should say, right?
Absolutely,
Tony Coelho
right.
and the
So
Democrats were as much implicated in this as the Republicans.
absolutely, it becomes the era of big money politics, and it's worth mentioning in one of the Powell memo task force meetings at Disney World. Can't make this up. I love this story. Okay, they have a meeting at Disney World where they fly in the then House Minority Leader Gerald Ford, William White, a U.S. steel lobbyist who's part of the task force, flies in Gerald Ford, and one of the agenda items was the Federal Election Campaign Act amendments that were in response to Watergate, and they're talking about how to get around them or how to put things into this bill that will still allow big money into politics. And what comes out of that is Gerald Ford, a year later as president, he signs the bill. And in the bill is the loophole that creates the modern corporate political action committee. So all that's to
Right.
mention that then into the 80s, corporate PACs become competitive and then not just competitive with, but sort of outspending in a huge way money
Right.
from groups like organized labor. So it becomes this era of big money politics. And towards the end of the 80s, there is this scandal, the Keating Five scandal, which sounds quaint by
Right.
current standards.
Right.
It's the Keating Five scandal is basically how politics works now, but it was a huge scandal back then. A big SNL mogul in Arizona named Charles Keating, who was also a big political donor, went to five senators, asked them to pressure a federal regulator to back off scrutiny of his savings and loan. And John McCain was one of those. And the scandal blows up. John McCain does not get indicted, but he's sort of hugely embarrassed. And he comes to the anti-corruption cause with the
Right.
zeal of a convert, ultimately championing the so-called McCain-Feingold bill, which is designed to reduce the channels through which big donors and corporations are going around the post-Watergate campaign finance laws, soft
Particularly
money.
soft money.
Soft
Right.
money,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Money
Right.
to
Right.
the parties.
Right.
And John McCain almost wins the Republican nomination for president, at least for a moment. It seemed like he had a chance to win,
In
running
in
completely
2000,
in
he
2000.
did win in 2008, but he ran in
Right,
2000. He
right,
almost wins on an anti-corruption message.
right. And his legislative campaign is so successful that even George W. Bush, Mr. Big Money, is forced to sign the McCain-Feingold law
Right.
in I think it was
Oh
2002.
two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So so the pendulum swinging back against corruption. And I should mention, meanwhile, there was a court ruling. This is on the Rehnquist court in this period of time that in Michigan, which stood up the idea that corporate donations in specific, it's called the Austin ruling, could be regulated. So the sort of campaign finance reformers anti-corruption movement has these victories, right? It gets the McCain
Right.
candidacy, it gets the Austin ruling, it gets the McCain-Feingold bill, and then the big moment in 2003, Mitch McConnell goes to the Rehnquist court and says, get rid of the McCain-Feingold Act, and the Rehnquist court upholds the McCain-Feingold Act. So this is like
Right.
okay, like we're going to have some there's a bottom here.
Right.
There's some walls on anti-corruption. And then of course comes this very, very short period in the mid 2000s in which William Rehnquist and Sandra Day O'Connor become on the Supreme Court John Roberts and Sam Alito.
Right.
And this is like the moment I think that basically really is the pivot point for the master plan. Now, remember, I haven't told the whole story, and you have to read the book about it. Like at this time, also the Federalist Society is being built. The entire judicial pipeline, the right wing, the conservative movement's judicial pipeline is being built so that
And there's
John.
a really interesting moment that I think we should get into where that movement shows their supremacy
Oh yeah, yes,
in the Republican Party
yeah, yeah,
because, uh, George Bush, a noted crony capitalist, a noted crony who has his buddies placed in all these positions, does that again with the Supreme Court. And the conservative movement, led by the Federalist Society, says, no, you cannot do that. And they succeed. So that, I think, is the real hinge point here.
yeah. So John Roberts was like created in a lab
Right.
to be a Supreme Court justice. He had like that was spring loaded from a long time ago in the early 1980s, right? He is this judicial star. He's aligned with the Federalist Society. He's in the Reagan administration. He's a big corporate lawyer. So by the time Sandra Day O'Connor says she's going to retire and William Rehnquist gets sick, he is sort of right there, sort of spring loaded to be one of the nominees. And he becomes obviously one of the nominees. And then when Rehnquist's sickness was the sort of the surprise moment, uh, they had to fill another seat, and Bush, instead of going to the Federalist Society, again, this sort of infrastructure created by the master plan to 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 create a judicial pipeline, Bush says, "I'm going to nominate my friend Harriet Miers." Okay,
Right.
Harriet Miers is his like pal from Texas who's the White House counsel, and she is, I mean, she's conservative, no doubt a conservative person, a loyal Republican, but she's not out of that like master plan pipeline. She is not kind of a John Roberts cyborg built in a lab to implement a partisan political agenda. And this is the moment where everything that's been built by the master plan, all the political and legal infrastructure, has to decide whether to go along with the Republican president, who's done a lot for them,
Right.
or go to war with him. And this movement decides to go to war with George Bush, ultimately getting him to withdraw Harriet Miers' nomination, and instead replace her nomination with an even more Terminator-like John Roberts style person, Sam Alito, right? So it was, and I think you're right. Like that moment reverberates because in just getting Bush to withdraw Myers, it was this message to all future Republicans, like, don't mess with the
Right.
conservative movement infrastructure that we've built. You take orders from us, not the other way around.
And
Uh,
particularly on the court. And I think that, the legacy of this is there were a lot of what I think conservatives would call botched nominations, where people like David Souter, who George H.W. Bush put
right.
on the court, John Paul Stevens, to a lesser extent, who Ford put on the court, who ended up, living out their tenures on the court as more liberal members.
Yeah, I mean the
And
mantra was no
yeah,
more suitors, right? They were really,
right.
really, really upset about David Souter. Like that,
And
like there were two formative things, honestly, in the conservative movements. Like it was the so-called borking of Robert Bork in their imagination, right?
Right.
Like that's a moment for them. And then we got David Souter, who becomes a liberal, and that can never happen again. Like that infuses all of this.
Right. And Myers represents that mainly because she's unknown, not necessarily because she's, going to go down this road again, but because she's unknown, personal lawyer, friend. She worked for a corporate law firm. She worked for Locke Lord, but was kind of unknown to this group that was dominating the space on the conservative side. I remember like writing. I was writing at that time. You were writing at that time, and I remember Harry Reid just sort of saying, we should give her a chance. Like, why not? He was like, how dare George, these people, go after their own president, and can't George Bush have the spine to stand up to these people? It was a very interesting moment where you didn't really know what was going on, but then if you went behind the scenes, you could kind of figure it out. And what ended up happening is that, yeah, they bared their teeth. and they showed their supremacy. And within just a year or two, or a few years, these rulings start running out that really push back the reform campaign finance reform movement.
Right. And so this is where Anthony Kennedy finally gets his chance, right? Anthony Kennedy, who has been on the court now and been a dissenter in a lot of these campaign finance and anti-corruption cases, who's been saying, I'm Mr. Money is constitutionally protected speech guy. He's getting sort of outvoted in the past. Now all of a sudden, and it's worth mentioning, he's not getting votes from Rehnquist or O'Connor on some of these specific cases. Now Rehnquist and O'Connor become Roberts and Alito. And the conservative movement that wants to deregulate campaign finance sees its opportunity and brings a series of cases testing the new court majority. We did an interview in this book with one of the architects of the ultimate Citizens United ruling, the legal
Mm-hmm.
architect of it, who talks about how he can't control the Supreme Court. All he can do is give the court an opportunity to go big. Anthony Kennedy, by the way, notably, a former corporate lobbyist who had become well known in Sacramento for handing out campaign cash to legislators, right? That's important context for understanding his view that money is constitutionally protected speech. Ultimately gets the opportunity, obviously, in Citizens United. And I think the thing that people forget about Citizens United, which we recount in the book, and I actually didn't really know the backstory, was the case. First of all, there's so many things about this. The case, first of all, is completely engineered. And what I mean
Right.
by that is, in the for those who remember or think they know the case, they might remember it as like David Bossie wanted to make this anti-Hillary movie in the context of the election, 2008. And the FEC knocked down his door and tried to, like, confiscate all the videos. Like that's not what happened, like, at all. What happened was David Bossie, the conservative activist, had a movie, a super
Yeah.
anti-Hillary movie, and then preemptively petitioned the FEC for an opinion about whether this would be considered regulatable electioneering under the McCain-Feingold law. I would argue that they did that because the real goal wasn't about the movie. The real goal was to get the court ruling. In other words, they
Right.
wanted the opinion from the FEC. So the FEC issues its opinion saying, yeah, this is a Hillary an anti-Hillary campaign ad. It's regulated by the campaign finance laws, and then they take that ruling and they go into court, right? So
Right.
they've engineered the case, uh, uh, and they go into court, and here's the other thing: the the court is considering ruling on just the merits of this particular case, right? The movie, the timing of it, is it electioneering, is it not? And they're debating whether to issue, behind the scenes here, whether to issue a narrow ruling on this. And reportedly, David Souter is like super pissed off that the court is even thinking about siding with David Bossie, even in a narrow ruling. And there we this we did not find, but there is a rumor out there that there is this barn burning dissent that
Right.
David Souter wrote and was going to publish about how the court was essentially a corrupt institution, like burn it all down. And John Roberts decides, you know what? Souter has just announced that he's retiring after this term. So I'm going to order this case for re-argument so that
Right.
Souter will be gone. And I'm going to and here's the thing. I'm going to order the case re-argued not on the small merits of the case, but on the larger giant question that Anthony Kennedy is working behind the scenes to get the case to be ruled on. Like, not about the specific movie, but about these huge issues. And so Souter's gone. They re-argue the case in the next year. And of course, then comes the Citizens United ruling, which has some of the most, I mean, truly, I mean, I think people forget exactly what Citizens United said. But I want to read like a quote from
Hmm.
this just to give people a sense of how insane this was. This is a direct quote from the ruling that comes out of Citizens United. This court now concludes that independent expenditures, including those made by corporations, do not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption. I'm going to continue here because it gets even crazier. Quote, that speakers may have influence over or access to elected officials does not mean that those officials are corrupt, and the appearance of influence or access will not cause the electorate to lose faith in this democracy. Okay,
Right.
like that is written into the ruling. Okay, and the effect of the ruling is that as long as a super PAC can pretend to be independent, and I really underscore pretend, that means
Right.
it can't be corrupting, and that means its spending can't be regulated, and it also means that donations to the super PAC can't be regulated because the court precedents are predicated on the idea that the only if money is First Amendment protected speech, the only justification for regulating that is an anti-corruption justification. But if a spending is independent, it supposedly can't be corrupting, and therefore it cannot be regulated. That's the
Yeah.
architecture that we now live in. Now, the last thing I'll say on this is that
Hmm?
nobody believes. Like, does anybody believe that if a senator is running for reelection and their former staff are running a super PAC, and the super PAC's entire mission is to reelect the senator and is raising money from donors who want things from that senator's, committee that senator runs in the Senate. Does anybody believe that isn't a potentially corrupting influence or doesn't create the appearance of
Or
corruption?
does
Like,
anyone believe it's independent? And I'll go you one
right,
step further. What we've seen in the post Citizen United world is the rise of this thing called the red box. And what the
exactly.
red box is that if a candidate is running for reelection, they will put on their campaign website, usually bordered by literally a red box that says, people ought to know this about my opponent, and lists a bunch of talking points that they want out there about the opponent, which is like this giant, literally red flashing signal to the super PAC that these are the things I want you to focus on. These are the things I want you to make ads about and attack my opponent about. And it's coordination with some thin reed that it's not coordination because it's all sort of happening in public. The candidates even put out B-roll of themselves in random parts of their website, pictures of them, videos of them talking to voters or whatever, so that they can be pulled off by super PACs to use in their campaigns. I mean, it is the most ridiculous thing, and all of this sanctioned by this ruling.
And you're telling that's like the nice normal version of this, right?
Yeah,
I mean, the 2015 indictment of Senator Robert Menendez was all about accusations that he essentially coordinated donations to a supposedly independent super PAC operating in support of his reelection in
right.
exchange for things, official acts that he was doing as senator, right? Like, don't give me the money, right? Don't give my campaign the money because you're not allowed. But
Right.
hey, the super PAC over there, you can give your money over there. So the whole notion that super PACs are independent and not corrupting forces is absurd, but that gets enshrined into law. Now, one other point to make here is that concurrent to all of this is a whole separate set of cases overturning bribery convictions, right? This is like a
Right.
concurrent line. This is from, you see the overturning of the conviction of Virginia Republican Governor
McDonald.
Bob
Yeah.
McDonnell,
Yeah.
aides to Chris Christie,
Right.
associates of Andrew Cuomo, culminating in the ruling last year, where an Indiana mayor gives a government contract. The government contractor soon after gives the Indiana mayor, I think it was a $10,000 payment. He had been convicted on bribery charges. The Supreme Court intervenes to overturn this, saying the sequence of events proves it's not a bribe, it's a legal gratuity. So
Right. A
they
tip.
are deregulating campaign finance, and they are narrowing the
Right.
enforceability of bribery laws. Now, I think we have to zoom out and ask the question, okay, all right, if all this is happening, why? Like, what's the point of all of this? And I think it goes back to like, this is why when I hear people talk about the democracy crisis, I'm
Right.
like, yes, Donald Trump, his authoritarianism, et cetera, his money in politics, corruption, like that's all a symptom of the democracy crisis. But if you're if you're scandalized by that, let me introduce you to the 50-year master plan to deregulate campaign finance and
Right.
destroy anti-bribery laws, because at the heart of this is the premise, I think, by the people who engineered the master plan. They understood that in a one person, one vote functioning democracy, they weren't going to be able to get the policies that they wanted that would preserve their wealth and power. In fact, they were getting Nader-ish policies that were
Right.
more responsive to what people actually wanted. So they understood that to deal with that, to deal with that democracy problem, if you will, they would have to rig the institutions of democracy to make it so more closely like a $1, one vote situation, aka not a democracy, where it looks like a democracy sort of aesthetically, but is not, but it's operating essentially as an auction.
Yeah. And so we've now progressed to this point where President of the United States can bulldoze a wing of the White House, put up a giant monument to himself, and keep inflating the price tag of it so he can get more and more corporations to pay for it, so that there's sort of inventory for this corruption, that there's there as long as private donors get to pay for this ballroom, then they can enact, they can extract favors from it, and also he gets to keep them in line basically with his program, because they're getting something out of it. And what he gets out of it is that the institutions that gave some mild pushback to Trump in the first term won't do so because they're getting a benefit on the side. And so, and under the current what we call laws, there's almost no way to break this cycle. It's just sort of reducing into an absurd track.
Now here's I think the silver lining. To
Right.
me, the silver lining is I feel like, especially, you and I are old enough to have lived through the time, a period of time where corruption was deeply embedded in the system, but there were attempts at plausible deniability, right? Like, yeah,
Right.
the money buys politicians, but maybe it gives donors more access, but it doesn't necessarily create outcomes. And the sort of the 90s and the 2000s, even into the 2010s, the sort of idea that like corruption is this thing that exists, but it's kind of soft corruption. It's not really like hard corruption. And so there was kind of like a plausible deniability. No, I don't necessarily think everyone really believed it. But now we're in an era of like explicit, flagrant, in your face, almost braggadocious corruption. And I think there's like, as much as Donald Trump is a pathological liar in his individual statements so often, that he's actually on this score almost kind of honest vibe wise, in that I don't think he's making much of an effort to pretend he sees government as anything other than a transactional process. I don't really think he's making much of an effort to deny the fact that the things that he's doing is enriching himself and his families. I mean, it's sort of goes back to the old so-called honest graft idea, right? Like, the Tammany Hall idea, which was like, yeah, corruption exists, but corruption greases the wheel. Corruption is always going to be there. And it's like, it doesn't necessarily connect to your life. So you, the voter, shouldn't care about it. This is just politics.
Right.
And I think there's like we don't have to convince anybody anymore that like corruption is here, it's bad, it's endemic. Like we're through that. Everyone sees that. Now the question for this moment, I think, is do we just accept that and say, okay, this is no longer a scandal, it's no longer a controversy, it's no longer even what we deem corruption, it's just what politics is. That is the pivot point that we're at right now. And that brings us to a case that's at the Supreme Court literally right now. Two cases are at the Supreme Court right now. One is a case spearheaded by J.D. Vance, designed, the specifics are he's trying to eliminate the remaining restrictions on how much spending, party spending, can be coordinated with candidates. Sounds like an esoteric issue. What it's really about is whether parties can be used as just backdoor conduits of unregulated money.
A return to soft money. Yeah.
A return to soft money. So J.D. Vance trying to take out what remained of campaign finance law after Citizens United. Meanwhile, there's a case coming out of Ohio, a conviction of a Democratic city councilman who's already been pardoned by Donald Trump, FYI. So it's the first case in anyone's memory where somebody who's already been pardoned for the conviction is still pursuing an appeal on this case. The case is being represented by Donald Trump's former Solicitor General. So the conservative movement, like this seems to me to be about a lot more than like one Cincinnati municipal deal. And here to me is the interesting thing. Remember the story about Donald Trump reportedly saying to fossil fuel donors, give me $1 billion and I'll give you policy favors? Okay. The appeal to the Supreme Court cites this specific example and says essentially, if you allow this conviction of this city council person to stand, an aggressive prosecutor under the same principle could prosecute this kind of thing that happened with Donald Trump and the fossil fuel industry as a quid pro quo deal, as if that would be a bad thing. In other words, the case is citing the pervasiveness of pay-to-play deals like this. Give me money, I'll give you favors. They are citing it being so pervasive and saying to the Supreme Court, thus and so, it is so pervasive that you should make sure to be clear that it is not prosecutable, because by allowing it to be prosecutable, you will be criminalizing what we should accept in America as just normal politics.
So those are two cases where the trajectory would get surely worse.
Yes.
I do think, because I think you're right that we don't have to convince any people anymore that this is happening and this is bad. What we do have to convince people of is that this can change. And there are actually two cases that I would cite where that is a possibility. And one of them, both of them, you have both written about at The Lever or talked about, and we've written about the prospects. So the first one is this antitrust case where MAGA lobbyists basically overruled the Justice Department's antitrust division in a case between Hewlett-Packard Enterprise and Juniper Networks. They wanted to merge. It's not important, but they do back office stuff for Wi-Fi and enterprise connectivity and networks. And the lobbyists basically got the heads of the Justice Department to overrule the antitrust division and allow this merger through. Because it was a settlement, there's an old kind of another post-Watergate law called the Tunney Act, because one of the things that Nixon did back in the 70s was he basically said, you companies that donate to me should be allowed to merge, essentially is what he said. And they put in this thing called the Tunney Act to say, well, actually a judge has to overlook these merger settlements to make sure they're in the public interest and that corruption didn't define the reason for the approval of the merger. And that's happening as we speak. There's going to be, in all likelihood, a Tunney Act proceeding in this case between Hewlett-Packard and Juniper, presided over by a Biden judge who was a labor lawyer named Casey Pitts in San Francisco. That has the potential to expose this pay-to-play corruption for all to see. So that's, at least, but that's more on the level of, hey, here's what's happening and we're going to expose it. Already the chief of staff to Pam Bondi has resigned because of this, doesn't want to be involved. The one that's, I think, more interesting is what's happening in Montana. And instead of me going over it, and we've written about it, but you've also done so, why don't you tell us about this situation in Montana, ballot measure, that could provide some of the initial pushback, really, to Citizens United?
So Citizens United and that whole string of cases relies on the idea that corporations are people. That presumption in the law from the Supreme Court itself is relying on state law that treats corporations as people. Now, states didn't always do that. Without going into the long, detailed history, about 100 years ago, corporations that were chartered by states with limited powers, and then there was a kind of race to the bottom. Everyone was competing to get corporations to come into their state. Ultimately, the bottom of the bottom of the bottom was essentially it was first the New Jersey paradigm, and then became the Delaware paradigm, but then became everybody's incorporation laws, which was fine. Corporations, there are no limits; they're just people. That became that's state law basically everywhere. What Montana is doing is saying, well, wait a minute, we never gave up our power to say that corporations aren't people. Like, we still have that power. If you're a corporation in Montana, and importantly, if you're a corporation that's not headquartered in Montana, but you're operating in Montana, you have to abide by essentially our incorporation laws. And the Supreme Court treats corporations like people because of those state laws. The Supreme Court has, for 100+ years, has made, in all sorts of rulings, states are the ones that decide, that create corporations. They are artificial entities, and if states are treating them as people, we will treat them as people too. The point being that Montana is proposing to change its incorporation laws to say, okay, corporations have all the powers that they currently have, except one power. They can no longer spend in elections, whether you're a corporation headquartered in Montana or a corporation outside of Montana operating in Montana. Inside of our state, you are not allowed to spend on elections. That's what they are proposing to put on their ballot. And I think what's really fascinating here is that they are using the Supreme Court's own precedents for this. And look, I know people will hear this and say, well, the Supreme Court can wake up every day and just decide to, throw out, stare decisis, throw out its own precedents. And yes, that is true. But I think just because something in the future could happen that would be like hard to believe, and in this case, like unwinding, 100 years of corporate law, there are things that the Supreme Court does not want to do. They don't necessarily want to touch any of that, right? So I just think like the future, they could do something bad is not a deterrent to let's do something within the rules they've set forth here that could be good. And it's
like the old Simpsons thing where Homer Simpson says to his kid, you tried and you failed. And the lesson is never try. Like that can't be the lesson here. And Montanans are trying.
Right. And I should also mention, there is also this other case that we're going to be reporting more in depth on soon, which is the case out of Maine, which also uses the Supreme Court's own precedent. It's a case spearheaded by Larry Lessig, but it comes out of Maine passed a ballot measure, I think it was last election, that said contributions to super PACs are regulatable, right? The super PACs operating in our state cannot take unlimited money. Now, this goes straight to the Citizens United situation, but in a different way. Citizens United said that you can only regulate donations that you can prove have a direct corrupting influence. That's why, at least up until now, you can't give $1 million directly to a candidate's campaign, because the idea is like you can regulate that because direct to the campaign is just obviously can be corrupting. So here's the interesting thing that happened. Maine passes this law, and they go to a federal court, the district court, and they cite all of these examples, like the Menendez example of the candidate used coordinated donations to a super PAC, which was in a corruption scheme. And the district court issues a ruling saying that actually super PACs, our finding is super PACs can be part of a quid pro quo corrupting scheme. Now, the district court also says, but they interpret Citizens United to mean that there's a threshold of corruption, that it's got to reach, like some corruption is allowed, but other corruption isn't. What Lessig's case argues is, hey, I now have a district ruling He's going up to the Fed, to the First Circuit, and ultimately probably to the Supreme Court, saying, hey, court, I have a ruling now from a court that says super PACs are and can be part of a quid pro quo corruption scheme. You have said that money that can be part of a corruption scheme or a quid pro quo can be regulated. Now I have a set of your own, a court saying this. We need you now to respect your own precedent when it comes specifically to super PACs. And I think, look, the Supreme Court could come up with a tortured reason to not, but I think there's a strong argument of using the Supreme Court's own precedent to say when it comes, Montana's dealing with corporate spending, direct corporate spend. Can corporations spend? This Lessig case is dealing with, can super PACs exist, unregulated, unlimited contributions to super PACs. So that's another place that I think this is a real live issue. And then, of course, the last thing that we really should talk about in the context of the New York mayor's race is, the takeaway, people, why has Zoran Mamdani been able to ascend? Is his charisma, his message, his slick ads, he's good on social media? I think actually the takeaway is the biggest factor is the one that hasn't gotten very much discussion at all, which is the fact that I believe there would be no Zoran Mamdani campaign without New York's system of publicly financed campaigns. And the Supreme Court has repeatedly said that publicly financed campaigns are well within the boundary of acceptable. They don't violate, First Amendment stuff that Citizens United is about. And for those who don't know what that is, very quickly, publicly financed campaigns essentially operate typically as matching funds, that they say, if you raise a certain number of small dollar donations, we, the government, will match those donations to the campaign. In New York, it's an 8-to-1 match. So Zoran
used to be a presidential version of this.
Technically, there still is, but the candidates
technically still is. They don't
Yeah.
use it, but it was famously opted out first by Barack Obama.
Yes.
That's the reason that it is essentially ineffective at this point.
Yes. But the point is that to my mind, if we want candidates to be able to run campaigns, competitive campaigns, particularly against oligarchy, like Zoran Mamdani's campaigning explicitly against billionaires, a candidate like that is not going to be able to raise competitive amounts of money campaigning against the givers of big money without a publicly financed system. And it's an anti-corruption thing too, obviously, because the money you get that's publicly financed money doesn't come with the demands of legislative favors once these people are in office. So I look at that and I say, the takeaway for anybody who wants less corruption in politics, and I don't care if you like Zoran Mamdani's politics or you hate him, if you want outsider candidates who are not beholden to big money and the corruption system, then you should be looking to the 14 states and 26 localities that already have publicly financed campaigns to expand those systems or to bring those systems to as many places as we can bring them. Because to me, regardless of whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, liberal, conservative, progressive, populist, whatever, that is actually the real answer here, ultimately.
Well, there's so much more we could get into. There wasn't nearly enough discussion of 1980 76ers topics, but we're going to have to leave it there.
Are you going to, don't accuse me of, some of my friends from back in Philly have accused my background here. I don't know if you see this, the fat lever jersey, the Nuggets. They've accused me of betraying the Sixers. And just so for anybody,
you're now
Philly,
a Denver resident.
I'm a Denver resident. I've lived in Denver longer than I ever lived in Philly. Although I obviously grew up in Philly. Charles Barkley is like my god, But I put it this way: the Nuggets are my favorite Western Conference team.
There you go.
And the Sixers are my favorite.
Hey, there's only one undefeated club among those two, and that's out in Philadelphia. So anyway, here's the book, Master Plan. Go get it. Great stuff. Great conversation. David Sirota, founder of The Lever, and you can find him at levernews.com. And thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was great. We do this every week. We'll put this up on the website, so tell your friends if you watch this, hey, go for a great discussion. over at prospect.org. And we will be back here next Friday. Have a good day.